Welcome everybody to the July 2023 edition of the Local History Guild. As usual, we have a stellar lineup this evening, engaging in all sorts of fascinating conversations about wreck and drift and the weed that washes up on the sea, and whether it has any practical value or whether it's actually just a bunch of rubbish that people would gather together and take pictures of and distribute to their friends thinking that it was beautiful. It was all of those things. And we our speakers this evening, I'm Mike Dyer. I'm the Curator of Maritime History. I'm your usual host for the Local History Guild. Immediately after my introduction to this subject, we'll have Melanie Correia, who's our exhibits manager. There's Melanie, and Melanie's going to talk about the exhibit itself and how it came about and how it's put together. Where all the pieces came from and how they fit together in the mind of the chief assistant to the curator herself, Naomi Slip, who is the curator of a singularly marine and fabulous produce, the Cultures of Seaweed. And then after that, we have a bona fide curator, Marina Wells, who has actually contributed an essay to this beautiful catalog seen here. It's a very beautiful thing, full color, tells you more than anybody really needs or wants to know about seaweed. But now the job is done, and you can have the catalog and you can read it and really enjoy the lovely photography and the great insights that are in it. Marina is our photography fellow, and she will close out our discussion this evening. So why are we here? What does seaweed have to do with the Local History Guild? It has plenty to do with us. We are a people who make the most of our coast. There can be no doubt about that. And for generation upon generation upon generation, farmers along the sea coast would gather cartload. They would get their draft animals and they would go down to the beach and they'd fill up their carts with seaweed, sometimes many times. Get this. I have this interesting quote here. This is from the New England Farmer for 1834. He's talking about a guy that lives down along the Potomac River, and he says, for 9 months in the year, from the 1st of August to the 1st of May, it is in great abundance, and my carts have usually carried out, according to circumstances, from 15 to 30 loads a day. During the last year, I applied to various crops about 3,000 loads of this manure. So when you read about seaweed and farming, you learn a lot more about animal droppings and urine than you really care to know. But apparently, the best way to work with the seaweed was to mix it in with the produce of the farmyard and let it all break down and then work it into the soil. Another guy says that rockweed, eelgrass, etc., are the most valuable of green vegetables for manure. They should be either plowed into the soil or mellowed in compost dung hills. It is a wrong practice to use them as top dressing. So what this person is saying is you spread it on the field and then you plow it in and let it work with the soil. This is particularly good for poor soils or for soils that have been worn out over season after season after season. You can add this dressing to the soil. There's actually quite a lot of really interesting stuff about this. Farmers who are situated near to the sea or have a vast advantage for manuring their lands. If they were once persuaded to make a spirited improvement, they might enrich their farms to almost any degree that they please. So from a practical standpoint, this singularly marine and fabulous produce, as none other than Henry David Thoreau himself describes it, has real value. Of course, as you poke around in the collections of local historical societies like the Westport Historical Society or the New Bedford Whaling Museum or others, you will see some pretty interesting photographs. They're all pretty much alike in a way. I'm not talking about the fine art yet. The fine art moves off into many different beautiful directions, and you buy the catalog or come and see the show and you can see what we're talking about. But for the most part, it was oxen and men, women, and children gathering up this stuff and piling into the cart. And that's what you see in the photograph, and that's what you see sort of often captured in the art itself, because it was it's a very interesting subject to see. It's not really something generally that we think about when we think about going to the beach. It's not a place of labor, certainly for anybody now. The only people laboring on the beach today are lifeguards. It's not really something that we experience a great deal of. However, for generations and generations in the past in our local area, and we'll see from the photographs that Marina is going to delve into, and some of the artworks that Melanie is going to show, that this was a real thing. Of course, as far as whaling is concerned, I'm sure most of the audience is familiar with the photographs of the wharves of New Bedford, late in the game, late in the 19th century into the 20th century, when the market was not very good for whale and sperm oil. Cargoes of oil in casks would sit on the wharf, and those casks were made of wood, and if they sat out in the sun, the wood would shrink and all the oil would leak out. And so in order to prevent this, piles and layers of seaweed would be layered over the tops of the casks, and redolent, I am sure. There must have been a really truly peculiar stink to the waterfront when that seaweed had been laid on top of the whale oil casks. That must have been a really beautiful scent wafting along the streets. But this was serious business. Seriously, though, in the Westport Historical Society, there's a very interesting court case, Reuben Anthony versus the Alan Gifford and George Gifford, and these guys, the Giffords, went down to the beach, and here Reuben Anthony had raked up all of his seaweed into a big pile, and the tide came in and floated some of the seaweed away, and Alan and George came down and they gathered up the floating seaweed and they took it with them. And Reuben Anthony took exception to this and sued these guys for stealing his seaweed. So that the court case actually ruled that the word adrift was sufficiently accurate to enable the jury to pass on the right of the plaintiff to take the seaweed. So that's kind of interesting. As Naomi Slip, the curator of the show, as she describes in her opening essay, the beach itself is the littoral is a constantly changing environment. And if you rake up your seaweed at low tide and don't move it until high tide, it ain't your seaweed anymore. It belongs to whoever can gather it up. So that's sort of what's going on. That's the practical aspects of this stuff. Has I think real interest to us, to our local history. But what do you think, Melanie? Is that a sufficient synopsis to launch the rest of the conversation?
Of course. Yeah, I'm happy to do that. And thank you very much. And it's helpful that you mentioned all of those photos, because I think I have most of them in my slideshow to share. So that works out perfectly. I am going to share my screen.
Yeah. Share that screen.
Share it. I know how to do this. So, all right. As Mike mentioned, I'm Melanie Correia, the exhibitions manager for the Whaling Museum, which is great and wonderful position. Basically, that means that I sort of put the things on the walls and I organize all of the exhibits that come and work with Mike and Naomi and Marina and all of our other curators sort of like make these visions happen. As Mike was talking about, here is our Seaweed Gatherers painting, which really was the impetus for our seaweed show. It is quintessential, exactly what Mike was talking about. We have the ox, we have the beach, we have the seaweed. They are gathering it. It is a gorgeous monumental painting that we have that came to us from the Acushnet Free Public Library, painted by Clement Nye Swift. The scene does not take place in New Bedford. It is in Brittany. But Swift's connection to New Bedford obviously brings that painting.
Where's Brittany, Melanie?
France.
In France, on the coast of France.
Yes, yes. So obviously not all of the stuff that we have in the exhibit look like this. And I guess what I want to talk about is a little bit like how an exhibit comes to be. Naomi was inspired by this painting in particular, and sort of the next steps are, what is it that we want to tell, and what kind of stuff do we have in our permanent collection to tell that story? So photography, like Mike was mentioning, is a huge one. Exactly like we were talking about. On the right, you see here the T.M. White's photo of wharfs on covered with seaweed. And we have a couple of other examples of sort of local seaweed gathering scenes, one from sort of late 19th century and one from the early 20th century, sort of doing it in different ways, you know, one's on land, one's on sea, but we have a few different examples. So we have some photos in the exhibit. We also have some prints that came from our collection, which are gorgeous, and similarly, the same sort of scene, people on the beach gathering seaweed. The one on the left here from New London is a Connecticut view. And really what we did with this story is that there is a New Bedford component. A lot of what we talk about is in New Bedford, but it is very much an international story. Seaweed Gatherers is in Brittany. There was a huge, like, sort of seaweed, you know, sort of not trade there, but and it was all over New England. It was not just
tradition would probably be fine. I mean, you could say
tradition. Yeah, yeah.
It's probably a very, very old activity.
Yeah, that's fair. We also have a number of like more science related and souvenir trade items in these albums that were both sort of souvenir things from California. And on the left is actually somebody's own personal pressed seaweed that we have in our collection, Sarah Sutcliffe. So these are just a few examples of like all the stuff we have in our exhibit that's from our permanent collection. But what else does that mean when we're trying to tell a larger story in the sort of seaweed tradition of the 19th century? And where are we lacking, and who can fill those holes? Most of the time, that means we're borrowing from other people. And we organize the exhibit a little bit sort of like in sections. So what we did was broke it up into a few different areas that we sort of concentrated on and sort of collected, not collected permanently, but sort of collected for the exhibit around those topics. Local seaweed scenes was definitely one of them. We have two examples here, one from Cape Ann and one from RISD. John Singer Sargent of near Boston and a Horizon in Gloucester. Actually, the Gifford is ours from Nonquit, which Mike was just at last night. It probably looks a little bit different now, I imagine, though.
You know, it really doesn't.
Doesn't know.
except there's no ox carts. Other than that, it looks pretty much the same.
Yeah.
I didn't see any ox carts there.
Maybe we'll have to bring our own ox cart next time.
Next time.
We also have just images of seaweed gathering, not necessarily local to us, but in general. These both came from local collections that were not ours, but were sort of wonderful sort of visual storytellers of that same idea. A major actually hole that we had in our collection was seaweed in design. Seaweed becomes hugely popular for interior design, pottery, as sort of aesthetics. And we didn't actually have a ton of stuff in our collection that mirrored that. So that's where we sort of started borrowing. These are all examples of different pottery that came from ceramics. Go ahead.
Hey, let me ask you something.
Yeah.
When it comes to borrowing, that there's a lot that goes into that. Did Naomi share with you, her sort of general curatorial technique of, was it networking, or was she working through the internet and searching catalogs? Do you have a sense of
both? I think. Yes, both. So Naomi actually worked with Maura Coughlin, who's a teacher at Northeastern, who also specializes in this sort of art history in seaweed. And the two of them had a sort of background, right? Like they know what they were looking for, and sort of search some of those collections out. But sometimes it was just reaching out to people and being like, hey, do you happen to know? I have an example of that later on that I can share a little bit more specifically. But these were all examples of things that came from other institutions. And Mike, like to your point, we do have like a sort of set way of asking. There are some institutions that you cannot borrow something if you don't let them know a year in advance.
Exactly what it is. I mean, this book has 180 plates in it. I mean, how many pieces are in this collection, in this exhibit?
So the book does have a lot more stuff than actually is in the exhibit. It is not a one-to-one thing. The book has everything we would have loved to show, but for space and conservation and a lot of other reasons, we could not obviously take everything. These are some things that we do have in the show. Ceramics, these were more like of that sort of interior design aesthetics. Wallpaper became really popular with seaweed. We have an example here. Again, all loans that came from different institutions, which are all really cool. And we've never really had a bad experience with another at least I haven't. I've come back to the Whaling Museum for about a year now. So people want to share their stuff. And, if you have a cool way to do it, I think people are happy to sort of share. This is an example of some of the things that we actually had to like hunt for. And this was where, Mike, you're talking about like those sorts of connections that we had to sort of try to get. So we knew, silver is a big, obviously you see here some examples of silver and seaweed, sort of like how that was sort of integrated into the silver aesthetic. Gorham was a big manufacturer in Rhode Island, sort of the impetus to start the RISD Museum. But we had asked them, because they have a huge silver collection, a lot of the silver has sort of the seaweed motif. Can we borrow some? And it couldn't. It was promised they had already had plans for it. So we did not have any silver to show for this, which was a bummer. Through some connections that Naomi was trying to make, reaching out to other people, do you happen to know anybody? We got both of these lenders that came through only within like a few months of the exhibit opening, which was really great. Cool. Tiffany was one of them. That came through a connection I think Naomi has at Skinner. She mentioned that we were looking for silver, and they were like, oh, have you reached out to Tiffany? Put them in contact, and they were wonderful to work with. So they lent us 5 pieces to are here. You can see the bowl and the flask. And the trophy is actually part of the New York Yacht Club's collection. And so they're lending that to us, which is also gorgeous. And that came cool as another connection. You ask, I guess, until someone says no. So another sort of topic that we wanted to focus on, obviously, was science. We have an example of an book here on the left. I'm going to not talk too much about that because Marina, I know, is probably going to cover that. But science obviously plays a huge role in women. Seaweed, plays a huge role in women in science, especially in this sort of later period. So this was really good examples. Anna Atkins is a really good example of that. Cyanotypes are super fragile. These books are really difficult to display because of the fact that like light exposure can damage them. So we actually do not have the book on the left in the gallery. This is sort of an example of like, sometimes you just can't put it out. It will ultimately like hurt the object to put it on view. So what we did was we reproduced it. So we have a couple of blow-ups, sort of like reproduced on large panels that you can see in the gallery. And we're able to reproduce one of the publications just in a bound volume that you can just like flip through.
What's the issue with saying with that book? Is it the paper or is it light sensitivity?
Yeah, it's light sensitive. Yep. There's actually seaweed in particular, because it's organic material, is super hard to display. So we asked for a lot of different albums, like seaweed pressed albums that for conservation issues were not able to be shown. And if you and I hope do come visit, you'll notice that there are some places in the exhibit that the light is very low, and that is to sort of save those.
We had pieces in the collection that were made by whalemen, didn't we?
I think so, yeah.
Yeah, it was like pressed on whale bone skeleton.
Yeah, that was some of those like earlier things that I had.
That's pretty.
This is another sort of little section that we had sort of broken the exhibit into, and it's industry and food. If you're all from this sort of area, you're probably familiar with clam bakes and seaweed's relationship to clam bakes, which we had some early photos of from the New Bedford Library, which was great. And this really cool thing, which is an installation, home installation that was discovered in a home in Mystic, early 20th century. They were using seaweed as home insulation. Can't imagine that smelt very good if it got wet. But it's really neat. It actually came from Mystic Seaport, and it was donated to them from an old director who actually was doing work on his house, opened up a wall and found this and donated it to them, which is really kind of some of the most fun stories.
Great.
So those are all of our sort of historic sections. Obviously, seaweed has a lot to do today. It's lots of things happening with climate change and ocean health that seaweed is sort of becoming involved in. We're talking about aquaculture or carbon sequestration. And so we do talk a little bit about that in the gallery and in the publication. But we did want to highlight that seaweed is still something that artists are using today too. These are all sort of examples of contemporary artists who are working with or are inspired by seaweed. A lot from Maine, a couple of other local sort of Rhode Island based artists. We have a few examples here. Celeste and Lisa are very much inspired by those early cyanotype, the Anna Atkins, which you'll hear more about after me, which is sort of great to sort of see that connection still. And here we have a couple of more examples of sort of contemporary different. This is a textile on the left that also has to do with the ocean movement and seaweed and all of that, how that goes, which is great. Like Mike mentioned, I did want to do a few fun facts. Our title is inspired by Henry David Thoreau's quote here in Cape Cod, talking about how it appeared to us a singular, marine, and fabulous product, which is where we got our title from. I'll give you a second to read it.
So were there any challenges to this installation, Melanie?
Of course, there are always challenges to every installation.
Yeah.
We had a particularly large vase that came from the Met. It's called a monumental vase. I don't have a photograph of it, but if you come to the gallery, you will not be able to miss it. It is huge and heavy. We needed a lot of people and a lot of support to get it into where it needed to be, but everything went great and it was wonderful. But it's one of those things that is sort of nervous in the moment. Of course, also our Seaweed Gatherers painting is huge.
Yeah. Right.
So, and that weighs a few hundred pounds. But we got it done. It looks great. Speaking of our Seaweed Gatherers, a little behind the scenes, here it is in the gallery. And actually our color palette was also inspired by the painting. If you'll notice, the woman's outfit is the same color as our walls. So we had a few different sort of highlight colors, but most of the gallery was painted to match her, to sort of highlight that connection between the two. It's a gorgeous painting. I love it.
It's great.
I don't want to take up too much more time, obviously, but I did have a few, these are some of my favorite things. So I just wanted to sort of show them. each fall sort of within those sections, but I didn't really highlight these two at the top. The woman who is fully covered in seaweed, this cabinet card, is great. I don't know if you can zoom, we can't zoom in right now, but there are shells and crabs and everything hanging off of her. It is such a cool photo. Comparatively, I also love this Andrew Zorn, which is another example of something actually we could not borrow because of its conservation issues from the BPL, but we were able to reproduce it. And in contrast to our seaweed covered woman, she is wearing nothing but seaweed on her head. So I sort of love those two paired together. The all the way on the right is an example of Gorham. I was talking about the silver, which was that trophy cup. They had their own pressed seaweed.
Oh, wow. Cool.
So that is also reproduced in our gallery along with the cyanotypes that you can sort of flip through and see like what were the seaweed that they were using and sort of compare it to what is ultimately on the silver, which is really neat. The bottom are just a couple of cool pieces of ceramics, some mocha and this little pitcher, which I thought were really gorgeous. The bottom one was a total random find for us, and it is one of the coolest albums that we have on view. It is from a Mrs. Margaret Woods. We do not know much about her besides that it's an English album. And this person came to us. They knew somebody who had heard about the show and was like, hey, I have this album if you guys are interested in it. And Naomi took a look at it and was like, yes, absolutely, please, we would love to show it. So Mrs. Woods basically starts pressing seaweed in the album early on. And it's very standard, sort of like you see in other examples where it's just like pressed seaweed and the title. As you sort of keep going, she gets more like adventurous with her seaweed. And this example here is one that she's sort of taken the seaweed and made it into an entire painting in this album. I hope that we might be flipping the pages here and there throughout the exhibit. So if you happen to come and see it, you'll probably see a different one. Maybe we'll make like a TikTok or something out of it. I don't know. But that is it for me, though I'm happy to answer any questions now or later. So we can hear from Marina, I'm very excited to talk more about cyanotypes.
So it really is quite an interesting, fact that some of these things have already been in the museum's collection for a very long time. It's one of the most satisfying aspects of being a museum curator is spending time with the collection and letting it work on you and vice versa. So what do you think about that, Marina?
I think that is a fabulous way to, sorry, just getting my cat out of the way, to introduce the exhibition. I think that Melanie kind of covered it, but I'm just gonna chat real quickly about a couple of different aspects of how seaweed connects to photography. So again, hello, I am Marina Wells. I'm the Photography Collection Curatorial Fellow here at the museum at the New Bedford Whaling Museum. And so there's a long history of how photography and seaweed connect, and it starts with the very earliest days of photographic history in Europe. I am interested in chatting a little bit about these cyanotypes, right, that are kind of canonical. If you open up a textbook about the earliest days of photography, you'll encounter Anna Atkins. And so I'll discuss her. Apologies, she is not local, but then I'll move on to some local photographers to discuss the folks like Robert Swain Gifford. You have James E. Reed, and then Dr. Henry Dudley Prescott, some of which you saw as previews in Mel's presentation, who will lead us to think, we have Anna Atkins getting us to think about science and art, nature and culture, and then these photographs of seaweed harvesting as making us think about sort of labor and leisure, and how seaweed is this connecting force that kind of intersects all of these ideas. But if you haven't thought about the very earliest photographic history in a long time, I'll just give you a little primer as it relates to Anna Atkins and her cyanotypes of seaweed. So as we know it, photography as we know it was sort of invented in 1839, somewhat simultaneously across the English Channel by both some folks in England and France, pretty much at the same time, fascinatingly. And the etymology of the word photograph, if you think about it, photo means light. You think of photosynthesis, and then graph means drawing. So you think of an autograph or a pictograph. So a photograph is a light drawing. And at its core, photography really just uses three things. It uses light, shadow, and then some kind of sensitized surface to make permanent an impression like this. So we have Anna Atkins, a British botanist who is now known as creating the very first book of photographs called Photographs of British Algae, Cyanotype Impressions. And it was published in installments beginning in 1843 until about 1853. Atkins was friends with folks like William Henry Fox Talbot, who had attempted fixing light-induced images, as he called them, as early as 1833, so quite early. And he is now known as one of photography's earliest inventors. He's sort of credited with being the earliest person to fix a light-sensitive image on paper. You might be familiar with daguerreotypes across the channel in Paris with Daguerre, but this is on paper. And Talbot is also in this circle with Atkins, with all of these sort of scientists and linguists and folks of great knowledge in different ways. And so there was a lot of sort of information exchange that's happening. He's kind of buddies with Atkins' father, and one of his early publications describing this process, just to give you kind of an idea, although I can, I'm sure you can imagine, he describes early on, a leaf of a plant or any similar object which is thin and delicate is laid flat upon a sheet of prepared paper, which is moderately sensitive, meaning sort of chemically sensitized. It's then covered with a glass, which is pressed down tight upon it by means of screws. So really, truly flattened on there. This done, it is placed in the sunshine for a few minutes until the exposed parts of the paper have turned dark brown or nearly black. It's then removed to a shady place. And when the leaf is taken up, it is found to have left its impression or picture on the paper. So it's interesting. I love this passage, obviously, to illuminate it. Describes exactly what the process is to create an image like this, but it also points to the fact that photography was not really standardized at this point. He describes it both as an impression and a picture, and not even a photograph at this point. It also is not standardized in terms of how long your exposures are. It's not standardized what type of photography you're doing. So Anna Atkins obviously is one of the very first folks that's using cyanotypes, which were invented in 1843. So she's quite early and getting onto this other type of cameraless photography that was helpful to capture specimens like seaweed to create these direct sort of impressions on paper. And you might be familiar with cyanotypes and their uses in architectural drawings later in the century. That gives us the name blueprints. They were quite inexpensive, so they were often used in the late 19th century for sort of, young photographers, college students, and things like that as well. So why seaweed? I actually just attempted to dry my own seaweed this week for the first time, and it's rather difficult. It's an interesting process, but it's captivating. These are beautiful images, right? They're sort of formally bizarre and gorgeous at the same time. So there's this beauty at the same time that these are collected scientific specimens. The heyday of seaweed collecting, as Mel was sort of pointing to, is around 1840 to 1860, so right in this period. And it built upon a tradition of natural history collecting, which you can think of any number of different folks that did their own kinds of natural history collecting, the New Bedford Whaling Museum among them, for example. Here we have Emily Dickinson's herbarium, so herbaria being, sort of collected actual plant specimens rather than their impressions. So Atkins is offering this sort of updated, more sort of mobile and replicable version of this. And Dickinson is a great example as well in pointing to the fact that women, again, were big practitioners of this, and wealthy women as well. But Atkins is a true botanist. She's a scientist. She had been an artistic, a scientific illustrator, and using this new medium, she more accurately sort of collects, indexes, and classifies about 400 unique different kinds of seaweed. And she published these in different volumes over those 10 years and produced an estimated 5,000 original cyanotypes. And allegedly, apparently, she actually produced every single one using the dried seaweed specimen rather than replicating one piece of paper as a negative onto another. So she did this all to offer them sort of as either gift books or scientific exchanges with other folks in her sphere, all of these scientific folks like Talbot and Sir John Herschel, folks like that. And it's just interesting to consider that this is such a scientific process. It was considered cutting edge to be able to document these images in this way. And that seaweed is kind of the perfect exemplar here because it's evasive in its form. It's always moving. It's always sort of dynamic in the water, right? So it's tough to capture, and photography as an invention that captures time, captures light, captures movement, really visually captures seaweed in a way that it never had been done before. So it lies at this important intersection of science and art. It's beautiful when it's submerged. It is also in this way, this sort of sinuous movement that it has in the water lends itself as ornamentation to other things, also as alluded to earlier, such as in the decorative arts. It becomes a sort of symbol or denotation of the ocean itself and wateriness, right? So it really lies at the intersection, both seaweed and photography, at the intersection of art and nature, science and culture, and also labor and leisure. So not all seaweed is super pretty. By the end of the 19th century, you could get your own camera and take pictures of daily life. And this included people, of course, in our own region on the South Coast, New Bedford area. And this was also a time when pictures of work were becoming increasingly of interest for fine artists, including painters and photographers like Robert Swain Gifford. So here I'm interested in how seaweed wasn't only understood as a science and something to document, but it was also interesting in its process of harvest for industrial purposes and almost romanticized in a way at the end of the 19th century in photography. So I'll just talk briefly about Gifford and then Prescott, or Reed and then Prescott. So you might be familiar with artist Robert Swain Gifford, who was born on Nashawn off Woods Hole, and he kept a summer home in Nonquit in Dartmouth, and he studied photography as early as 1867, which is very early for a sort of amateur. It wasn't his profession. And here he captures seaweed collection in skiffs that are drawn directly, they're drawing seaweed directly from the sea. And it looks like this little vessel here is loaded kind of up to the brim. He also captured seaweed gatherers with their wagons and their aforementioned oxen on shore in these very fun images, this child here being a sort of bystander, perhaps participant. And Gifford also painted images that I would like to think are inspired by some of his photography. Impossible to prove, and the timeline's perhaps a bit off, but of course there are scenes that he replicates in both painting and photography that you can see resonate with each other. And they're sort of notable for this nostalgic theory. They almost don't, nostalgic quality where there is little else going on in the frame except for this activity, this commercial activity at its heart, right? That it seems like this is agricultural. It seems like it's far away from a sort of modern world at this turn of the century moment, or late 19th century moment. But in reality, it's an industrial practice. It's an industrial industry. So of course it was used not only in its collection as fertilizer, as food, as a component in creating glass, also in photography and photographic film, interestingly, as well as insulation in homes, and as this sort of strange moistening agent, this sort of insulating factor for barrels as well. So of course, it's tied to the industrial world, right? So other photographers like T.E.M. White and Stephen F. Adams show us that in New Bedford's urban landscape, industrial applications are related to whaling, and seaweeds placed on these wharfside barrels in order to keep their staves moist so that the wood doesn't expand or contract too quickly and either leak or burst in some way. You know, you can imagine on a hot summer day like today. And here's just a fun detail of this image for my local history buffs here. A lot going on here. I like the two guys on the right working on the boat there. This is probably taken from an upper window by White and Adams. Other views were also captured by photographer James E. Reed, who documented the waterfront in his years in New Bedford. And he was born in 1864. He's a Black photographer. So he's born during the Civil War in the South, likely born enslaved. And he becomes a photographer in New Bedford by the 1880s, and then works with Phineas C. Headley, and then strikes out on his own by the 1890s. And he's a successful studio photographer. He does a lot of portraiture, but he also does these views which ostensibly were sold commercially, which is really interesting, of the waterfront. So his later views, this one probably taken in the 1890s, shows how seaweed might have been part of the regular comings and goings of the New Bedford waterfront. And despite, again, that photography is a visual art, you can definitely get a sense that maybe the waterfront had an olfactory quality that would be difficult to avoid with this much seaweed around. And yeah, you just get a full sense of that with these waterfront views. So Reed wasn't the only photographer who monetized views of seaweed as an industry, which is really interesting. We have these, I believe we have 3 of these actually in the collection, these stereo views, which are a form of photography that was meant to be placed in a stereo viewer. So these 2 views, very similar to each other, would become one and create a sort of 3-dimensional image in a stereo viewer, almost similar to a virtual reality experience today. But it would land a viewer in that very space. It would make them feel all encompassed by it. And so it's interesting to imagine why and how seaweed as an industry is something that a leisure activity. Stereo cards are predecessors to postcards. They were collected and distributed among friends. And why would a viewer want to be transported to this scene of all scenes, a sort of salty, sticky, stench-filled activity that you're not really participating in? So just something to consider, our sort of labor leisure binary here. By the 20th century, photography can be used by anyone with a camera and whoever wants to take snapshots of their daily lives. So we have these fun photos of people using seaweed in the South Coast region for clam bakes, wherein, again, of course, seaweed would insulate cooking clams with their own salty steam. And Dr. Henry Dudley Prescott, who documented his life in a series of over 100 photographic albums that we have in the collection at the Whaling Museum, he caught this sort of seaweed gathering and then using at clam bakes in the early 20th century. So seaweed continues to occupy this conceptual space between labor and leisure, nature and culture, and it definitely remains relevant today. I am struck by all of the visual experiences in the current exhibition that bring the very earliest photographic history up to the present day. So multiple contemporary artists utilizing cyanotypes as a process currently to grapple again with seaweed's formal qualities, with its sort of sinuousness and strange, difficult to render forms, and its relationship to climate change and ecological issues, as well as the long history of photography and seaweed as arts and sciences. And I think we can all remain sort of interested in it as towing a line between nature and art. There's a lot more to read about this in the catalog. Again, I am just scratching the surface, but I'll also be leading a workshop this week on Thursday if anybody's around and wants to join to make our own little cyanotype prints using dried seaweed. So that's about it from me. Thank you.
Well, I think there's quite a lot, quite a lot to the modern realities of aquaculture, seaweed aquaculture. It's a carbon sequestration for sure. It locks in a lot of carbon in the sea, but it's also nutritious and edible. And cultures have been eating it. We were touring around up in Nova Scotia and stopped in on one of the Bay of Fundy ports and went into the store, and they've got bags of dried seaweed that you can buy and eat it, and it tastes pretty much like seaweed. It's not this, I think it's an acquired taste. It doesn't taste like potato chips, even though it looks like sort of green potato chips, but they're not that. There's a lot, I think there's really quite a lot to it. And sort of Japanese cultures, of course, have been eating, seaweeds for a very, very long time. And cultures all around the world have been cooking with it. So, that notion that you dig a hole in the sand and build a fire and cover your foodstuffs with seaweed to steam and to cook, it's all around the world. So, I mean, this is common. I strongly suspect that if, we did this talk, on the beaches of Queensland, the people sitting there would be scratching their heads saying, what are you talking about? We always do this. This is, this is our life. But, to your point about industrialization, the rubber's really going to hit the road with this stuff coming up, because it has actual industrial applications. I think we saw a little bit of that, you see a little bit of that in the exhibit. We're going to see a lot more of it coming up in coming up in years to come. So you guys did a great job. I don't really see any questions in the chat. So I think what that means is that you have covered the material so thoroughly that that people are completely satiated, but nonetheless, it's a great show. The catalog is really superb, and I would encourage everybody to come. Now, coming up, August 15th, for those of you who remain, Tuesday, August 15th is part 2, backed by popular demand, of Steamers of the Bay and Islands. So we will have Elizabeth York and Bo Van Riper and Michael Harrison and Bob DeManch and myself will be talking about the steamships of New Bedford, the Bay, and Vineyard Sound, out to Nantucket, and out to the Cape. So that's going to be coming up in mid-August. So
Wow, what a lineup, Mike.
what's that?
What a lineup. That's great.
I know. Well, if you think about it, Melanie, I mean, it just simply reflects reality. I mean, one of the things we don't really think too much about is in the pre-canal days, New Bedford was the city.
Mhm.
Like New Bedford was the city, man. You got on a steamer from the islands or the Cape, and you came to New Bedford because you were going to the city there, and you'd go down to Wing's department store, and you would experience something that these rural communities simply didn't have, and then of course vice versa. You could go out to vacation, which is a sort of bizarre concept in and of itself. If you think about it, the idea of not working, of choosing to go someplace else to lay around in the sand and then soak up the sun and do nothing. Sounds pretty un-American to me.
Sounds great. No,
I'm telling you. So anyway, so that's coming up. It is a great lineup. It was actually Bob DeMansion and Elizabeth York's idea. Bob contacted us and said, "Hey, have you seen this? This great." Elizabeth York is the director of the Cape Cod Maritime Museum. Have you seen this really cool thing that she does about the steamships? And so we built a program around it, and people liked it so much that we're going to build another one. So so that's coming up on August 15th. So oh wait, is there a question? Great talk. No, Beatrice is very happy. Beatrice Oliveira is very happy with us. If Beatrice is happy, everybody's happy. Now let's see. I seem to have lost you all.
we're here.
Oh, there we go. Okay. So thanks, Melanie. Thank you, Marina. Thank you, Carissa, for your good technological guidance. And well, I guess we'll see each other tomorrow in the office.
That's true. Thank you, Mike.
Yeah.
That's great.
Yeah, you're very welcome.
Thanks everybody for coming out.
That too. Yes. Thank you, everybody.